Their stress response, and how I look at it, is that there's an event that occurs, and then there's the nervous system's response, and then there's the behavior that follows that, that's dictated by physiology.
Welcome back to the Smarter Not Harder podcast, your home for 1 cent solutions to $64,000 questions. I'm your host today. My name is Dr. Scott Sherr, and it's a pleasure to be back with you. Our guest on today's show is a good friend of mine. His name is Brian Mackenzie. We had a great conversation. A little bit on Brian here. Brian is the founder and CEO of Shift, which is a really awesome website you guys should check out. He's also the president and co-founder of the Health and Human Performance Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the research on how breath and innate tools can optimize and help health and human performance. He's an innovator in human performance on stress adaptation and a pioneer in the development and application of custom protocols to optimize human health and performance. His work harnesses integrates respiratory, movement strength, conditioning, and endurance-based training approaches to elicit unprecedented positive results. His protocols have been used to accelerate and raise both mental and physical performance in world-class Olympic and professional athletes, top executives, and elite military operators, as well as to improve the health for people suffering from various chronic and pathological issues. So I've known Brian for over a couple of years at this point now, but really got into the weeds with him over the last several months, almost about 6 months, on respiratory physiology. And so it was really fun to have him on the podcast to really get deep into this world. And so here's some of the things that we spoke about. We spoke about what Brian actually does for a living, which is not exactly what you would think. We spoke in detail about CO2, about carbon dioxide, and how this extremely important waste product in quotes is fantastically, it's so important in respiratory physiology. We spoke about the trials, tribulations, the good, bad, and the ugly, about hyperventilation, including practices like the Wim Hof method. Not all bad, not all good, but all in context. We spoke about CO2 and building up CO2 tolerance and how this affects your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, how this affects your aerobic and anaerobic metabolism and capacity. We then chatted about nasal breathing and why this is so important, not only in the nasal inhale, but the nasal exhale as well. We talked about the fountain of youth with hypoxic training and hyperoxic training and how you can bring these things together once you have a good foundation. We also spoke about his nonprofit organization and his work at Shift. This is just a little bit about what we spoke about. We really go into the weeds here, ladies and gentlemen. We go deep into respiratory physiology. We talk about capillary and blood stealing. We talk about CO2 and the oxygen dissociation curve. This is a really fun podcast for me to record with Brian. I really hope you enjoy it. Final mention, this podcast is brought to you by Health Optimization Medicine in Practice, a nonprofit organization training doctors and practitioners on how to optimize health, as well as Transcriptions, accompanied with pharmaceutical-grade precision dose and physician-formulated buccal troches for focus, for mitochondrial optimization, and for stress relief. Hope you enjoy the show, everybody. Have a great day. All right, Brian, how are you, man?
All right, Scott.
You like my podcast voice? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, yes. I'm doing well. I'm coming off a pretty heavy ride from last week, but I'm coming around.
Oh yeah,
Johnny
working
Cash
too hard?
might say. No,
As
well,
usual?
sort of. I went up to Pelican Bay State Prison last week.
Oh wow.
And I've been working inside the prisons for some time. And it was a heavy experience. So
what kind of prison is it? Is it a maximal security kind of prison, or is it?
Pelican Bay is the most, if not one of the most secure prisons in the United States. It is a or the biggest maximum security prison, other than a federal maximum security prison. Mm-hmm. Which a federal maximum security prison is probably going to house people who have committed more federal type crimes, right? Mm-hmm. In state prisons, what you have is people who have committed, especially at this level, I mean, you have people who have committed murder, etc., involved in mostly gang stuff. So yeah, and it wasn't actually the prisoners that were the heavy thing, as I've spent much time around prisoners. So yeah.
So how long have you been working in the prison system? We'll start here because this is interesting. Yeah.
Probably close to 4 years now.
How'd that start?
Yeah.
How'd you get started in that place?
I lived a little less than 5 miles from San Quentin State Prison, and connected with a guy who runs a program. His name is Scott Budnick. He's a filmmaker. He's also a DJ, but he has been going into the prisons and the juvenile system for more than 20 years now at this point, helping mentor guys. And he has another nonprofit organization called the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, ARC. And it takes guys and gals who are on real long sentences, and they mentor these people before they get out, because there's a big, so recidivism being the name, we have a big problem in this country with actually prison rehabilitation. We don't actually rehabilitate.
What's the incentive?
Depending on where people stand on these issues, I'm actually doing a write-up for our newsletter on this right now, and this was the bigger, deeper dive that I got into this week, because I was up there with a lot of people who fund things, and I'm around people who tend to be on the opposite end, which would be the conservative side of stuff. Because of my background within the firearms community, I've played, and even beyond the firearms community, but working with inside the military, et cetera, you're around a lot more conservative folks. And this weekend, or this last week, I was around very liberal leaning folk who would, like, on one end, you either want to shut down the prisons and totally reform everything, and on the other end, you do not want that. You want people locked up, throw away the key, isolate them, do all that stuff.
3 strikes and you're out, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. My experience is very different from any of those opinions. I do not think that people should just be let out. However, you can't. Isolation's never worked. We know this from not only looking at the neuroscience behind this, but looking at the psychology behind this. Factual information, science has done the research. Isolation does not work.
It kills people by itself.
It does. And there are programs and things that do work real well. At any rate, my work, I've been going in because I've been teaching these guys another tool, right? And the tool ends up leading these guys down a path, or opening doors for themselves and understanding themselves. So getting an idea of, like, hey, maybe I am pretty reactive towards certain things. And I could use some work there, and it's had profound impact, such profound impact that I'm at a commitment to this. However, I'm not standing on a soapbox wanting the world to understand my passion at this point with the prisons. I'm perfectly fine going in and starting this process, and it's having its own effect from the inside, which has transcended into, from what I've seen, is transcended into the staffs of the correctional officer population. It's having an effect on them in a positive light. And if you think about it, it works like this. You have a positive prison population, you will have a very positive staff population. When you have a prison population that is highly negative and trying to kill each other or hurt each other, you will have a very different staff. You will have people who do not like going to work, who are scared for their lives, are worried about things, and it just has an impact. So I'm just somebody who's found some stuff with inside the prisons. I ran a program at San Quentin, namely, for about 6 months, and then stuff came to a halt with COVID. But then I've gone back up to I went up to Corcoran State Prison, and then I've gone to the juvenile place out at Sylmar in LA. And then I was just up at Pelican Bay, and I have plans of being back in the juvenile stuff, going back up to Corcoran, the SHU up at Corcoran, and the THU, which is the transitional housing unit. So if you decide you want to get out of the gangs, they have a transitional section. But the secure housing stuff is it's coming to an end, which is good, as it's never served a real purpose. It's pretty gnarly to see firsthand with the 100 or so guys that are left in the SHU. Getting
It's
to
called
work
the
with them.
Shoe. Is that right?
Yeah, it's called the SHU, the
Okay.
Secure Housing Unit,
Oh,
SHU, the
SHU.
SHU.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And it's usually you go into the SHU because you've actually tried to hurt somebody pretty badly, stabbed usually, whether it's staff or another prisoner.
Right. So while you're in prison, this is where you go.
Correct.
Right.
And
More on the
most of the
isolation
guys
side.
that are
Yeah.
inside are earning points in the upward fashion, which gives them more time. So
I
a
see.
lot of these guys end up getting more time, and then they do a lot of time in the SHU. I mean, I've met guys this week who had done more than 30 years in the SHU.
30 years.
30
Wow.
years. Yeah.
This is isolation from almost everything except for what, maybe a small amount of time during the day?
Correct. If you do not have somebody in your cell, then you do not see another human being. You'll hear them. The only other person you see is a correctional officer who will escort you out to your, I think it's 1 hour or less, to a space like the size of this, a little bit bigger than this room I'm in. It's a few hundred square feet,
Right.
but it's concrete walls that go up to these windows up top that you don't see outside. You basically are just it's intense.
Talking about vitamin D deficiency and going psychotic, right? So,
Yeah,
I mean, and
yeah,
everything else that goes along with that, with circadian rhythms and hormone cycles and
yeah.
everything else. My goodness. Well, I think this kind of bears the question, Brian. I mean, you have an amazing bio. You've been around for a long time, but like, you're in the prisons, you're working with high performers, you're at the beach surfing and doing all these amazing things. Like, when somebody asks you the question of like, what do you do? Like, how do you answer this question? Like, do you have like a one liner, or does it take longer just to take a full podcast to figure that out? Which we can do. We can talk about all that
Well,
too.
so it's so funny that you asked this, because Tiana last night at dinner proposed the
Brian's
same
girlfriend.
thing.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, she proposed this same. Not question. She has an answer for it in her own.
Right. In her way. Yeah.
In her way, because she'll end up referring people to me from time to time. And I say that not because she wouldn't refer everybody, but it's going to require somebody who's ready for some work.
Sure. Right. I get it. Yeah.
But she was like, "You actually help people develop relationships," and I was like, "Oh, that's an interesting way a thing." I'm like, but because I think of it like, what I do is I introduce people to themselves.
Mm-hmm. So a relationship with themselves, kind of thing.
Yeah, I go at it. It starts with you, like, and then it ends up transcending out. Most people want to fixate on, my relationships with others versus my relationship with myself.
Indeed.
And that's a very fruitless process.
Well, there's a Michael Jackson quote, song from the 1980s, right? So you got to change yourself if you want to see the change around you, right? And it's corny, it's ridiculous, but in fact, it is true. And so you're in the relationship business, it sounds like, but this is in the relationship of our internal self and to how we sort of manifest that within the world that we have created around us, kind of deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Short story.
Yeah. And so how I do this introduction of somebody to themselves is through stress, that's usually in the physical sense. And most, because I help people develop a physical practice. So somewhat of a practice that revolves around them getting to learn about themselves. And then outward from there, it becomes, how you're functioning throughout your day, and where we can actually insert many of the tools, or, specifically things like breathing, breath work, et cetera, in order to take the opportunity to stop reacting and to start responding and understanding yourself a bit more. So yeah,
I love it. Yeah. So basically the relationship through stress is the way you kind of, and the stress is stress is a very interesting word, right? Because people think of sort of, good stress, bad stress. There is such a thing as both of those things, and not all good stress is always good. Not all bad stress is always bad. There's a significant continuum between the two. And one of these, the thing that I think you and I really connected on is respiratory physiology, in the sense that as you know, I specialize in hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and I'm all about oxygen, and I'm all about understanding how we make energy effectively using our citric acid cycle, our Krebs cycle, how we detox effectively from the waste products of energy metabolism, including carbon dioxide specifically. Although, carbon dioxide is a funny one, because, we think of it as our favorite waste product. But Brian, I want you to tell us a little bit about your relationship and how you create the relationship in your clients with carbon dioxide, because I think this is really the crux of a lot of the work that you do specifically.
Yeah, I'll steal some work right now from a guy by the name of Campbell. I forget his first name. He's written a book called 50 Years Lost in Medical Advance.
Okay.
And it's revolves kind of around the stress mechanism. There is good stress and bad stress. However, any and all bad stress seems to be something where the system can't recover from the stress mechanism, and that's that's an intricate process that involves the nervous system, capillary gate theory, tissue repair theory, and a number of aspects of that which are far deeper, which your medical crew is going to understand a lot of that. The vast majority of the populace will not. I look at stress. I think Gabor Mate broke it down best, but I take aspects of what I just kind of brought up. The last part of that is actually what's happening in the endothelium, right? And that's where disease starts to really show up, especially namely cardiovascular disease. Right. And this is also just a byproduct of what you've also brought up in the Krebs cycle, oxygen, et cetera. It's all connected, interconnected, whatever. But their stress response, and how I look at it, is that there's an event that occurs, and then there's the nervous system's response, and then there's the behavior that follows that's dictated by physiology, right? So physiology then, so the waterfall effect of our physiology occurs, in a lot of those cases, it's like, your heart rate goes up. In some of those cases, it's like adrenaline comes in fairly quickly. So you're getting these and then you're getting glucocorticoids a little bit further down the road, like at 30 minutes or so, right? So your cortisols, et cetera. But so the hormone, the endocrine system's involved, all of this stuff happens, and we're internally, we are responding to this. However, when we come back up to that first phase of stress, the event, and if I were to just use a car cutting me off, that is an event, right? So a car swerving in front of me or cutting me off, the event has happened. What happens next is my nervous system's response to that, and it's either I'm swerving or my foot's hitting the brake, right? It's not a thought process. It's totally unconscious, but it's a response to something because I've learned how to drive, and I'm reacting immediately to that. Then there's the flood of things that happens as a result of that. So that, for most people, becomes you asshole, right? Like anger occurs, right? Like all of these things start to occur. So there's the behavior that happens after it, right?
Sure.
And that is happening with just about everything we've got going on throughout our day. From what I've been able to do work on, not only on myself, but with the people I've worked with. And so it doesn't all happen like a car cutting me off. However, you'd be surprised that, like, the analogies I can use with just a car in and of itself, it's very interesting because we've become so accustomed to driving that we believe we can do a lot of other things while we drive. And I've really invested in this process and really looking at that, not only myself, but even other people who are driving when I'm with them.
Sure.
And it's interesting because we're just trying to do as much as we possibly can with something we're bored with. And we are lacking this presence to ourselves and what it is we're actually doing. And so we're taking on more, or what we could also look at this is we're giving away something that is so finite and we don't realize it. And it's called our attention.
Attention is where everything lays, right? In the sense
100%.
of the present moment. And the challenge with the world today is that we have so many inputs coming in from all different sides of everything. And then the cars are now set up so that you can be as distracted, like the Tesla, for example, with its gigantic screen and all the kinds of things that you can do while your car's on autopilot. And it just plays into the aspect that our attention, I think I was looking at the statistics. I don't know if you've seen this, but I think the average attention span of, I'm not sure if it's an American or if it's like an adult, is about 6.25 seconds right now. And so the amount of time that we can spend on one thing without getting lost in the next squirrel or the next moment is pretty dramatic at this point. I mean, this is why we have things like all the social media channels that have less than 1 minute videos, but like better yet, 7 seconds, right? That's the actual attention span of these things.
Another good, not to overwhelm people with driving, because that can tend to really, I usually mess people up when I go to talk somewhere, and at the end I challenge everybody to drive a week under the speed limit. And basically,
oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, the crowd response usually is like, "Oh, hell no, that's not happening." But it's a telling thing. Anyway, another telling, very easy thing to do is the next time you go wait in line somewhere, don't pull out your phone.
Right. Feel that urge and just leave it there. Right.
Yeah. Just sit there and observe yourself trying to react to the uncomfortableness of just being there, right?
Right. Or go to the bathroom without it or something, right? So
there you go.
You mentioned something like in the work I think you said of Campbell earlier that was interesting to me as an oxygen guy, and getting back to that in a minute. But
I'll circle back to that.
No, it's okay. No, it's all good. Because I think the stress piece is so involved in how we breathe, right? And that's I think that's where you're going as well. But one thing that I was thinking about, and I don't know if you can dig into this a little bit, was this capillary gate theory. Do you know anything about that you can chat? I mean, that sounds interesting to me. Maybe even at a high level, because I think this goes along with understanding our stress response and our nervous system response, I'm guessing, to stress. Yes.
So I'll just brief on it. I don't want to go too deep into it. It's robust, but it has to do with how the capillaries basically will when we go into a sympathetic response, right? They sphincterize immediately based on chemical reactions, the nervous system's reactions, etc. So
and so then as a result of that,
response is very natural and very normal.
Right.
The moment we go into this, and this has cardiovascular impacts.
Right.
And people don't realize that the heart doesn't just like pump, like like it twists and pumps and it does a lot, man.
Right.
And the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for this, right? Like it's doing this stuff in order to transmit how blood's flowing, etc. There's communication going on, and so capillary gate theory goes into how this phenomenon occurs, and it is important because there are few that believe it's at the foundation of where disease is. Because if you go back to the event, the stress event, where I was going with that is that the event happens with the car cutting me off. However, I return to that if I'm the person who can't let it go that somebody cut me off in traffic. And now that event is on replay. So there's a quote by Eckhart Tolle where he says, in a healthy organism, an emotion is a short-lived response.
Yes, that's beautiful.
And unfortunately, we don't understand our feelings that we're feeling on that third end of what I was talking about with the stress response. So this is where psychology just misunderstood physiology, right? So I've got this physiological response occurring to an event, and through that process, I'm then returning to the event and rolling through that again, right?
Even if it's just a thought, like you said, even if it happened yesterday or the day before or 2 years ago, you can imagine or think that thought, and all of a sudden that stress response comes back. It's a very human trait, as we know. I think we're the only animals that do this. I think I've heard you talk about maybe is it zebras or giraffes or like their stress response and how it's actually physiologically, you can actually see them go from sympathetic to parasympathetic in like seconds, if I believe. Is that right?
Yes. In a very short period of time, typically, right? I'm not suggestive that we go back to being wild, but however, there's a lot to be learned about that. Right.
How they can shut off that response so quickly.
If I go back to replaying the event in a heightened emotional response, and I want to be very clear, this isn't just about anger. It ain't just about being sad. Excitement is a drug, and it is a relive drug that we continue to chase because it comes off, right? And so happy all the time is not a good thing. Like, we're supposed to come through these things, right? It's supposed to ebb and flow. And
yeah, we call it just at our company, we call it dynamic equanimity or equanimity, in the sense that you're always you're always trying to stay at a baseline, but you're coming up and down. Like, that's the idea. But if you have a good practice, it's a physical practice, a meditation practice, a mindfulness practice, you don't have the ups and downs that are so dramatic, either extremely happy or extremely sad. You have more of a dynamic equanimity across that spectrum of emotions, knowing they're all just figments of your imagination anyway. It was what it comes down to. So I was just talking to my daughter about this earlier. I mean, every emotion you have will go away. There's no way it's going to stay forever. You have to like actively work on keeping things there, but you can have these revisiting of emotions and things like that, just with these thought forms as we talked about. But what it comes down to, though, with the stress response is that this is our sympathetic nervous system going into action, right? Yeah. And so let's talk and dig into a little bit about CO2 and how this all kind of plays into it, and then we can kind of go from there. Yeah.
Yeah. So as I come back to the thinking process, I have instigated this capillary gate theory again.
Right.
And so on the other end of that is tissue repair theory, which is where, when I have a heightened response like that, this is like, think of strength training, right?
Sure.
Like, I go work out and there's a response to that. And if I recover from that, I get a growth phase, right? So I repair, right? Tissue repair, right? Just the simple, very, very basic terminology around this. At any rate, coming back around, it's so stress in and of itself, we're hardwired for it, just like every mammal on this planet. But we are in a constant state of energy production, or not, I shouldn't say production, transfer, right? So we're simply transferring energy, just we're doing it in the human form, which is through basically the Krebs cycle and or cellular respiration. And on both ends of that, you could have aerobic and anaerobic, correct? So with that, our nervous system, the only way for us to do that efficiently or effectively, which is a deal that was made 2.5 billion years ago, is through this Krebs cycle, basically. And we need oxygen for that process. And the interesting thing is though there's very little when we are conscious that's driving respiration as a result of oxygen. It is, however, what we are driving respiration through is mainly are through chemoreceptors that are responsible for CO2 detection, pH detection as it gets more acidic, baroreception, right? Like, so pressure changes. And then there's stuff in the lungs we could talk about, but it's not as important. However, there's stretch reflexes, et cetera, things that'll set things off.
Right.
But by and large, your breathing, when you're not thinking about it, is happening due to CO2. And there's an area in the brainstem that is called the pre-Bonster process, and it is picking up CO2, right? So there's detections that are happening within the carotid and the aortic valves of the arteries.
And the arteries,
yeah. And so that is an indication that, also nothing's happened yet. We're in the arteries that are going somewhere, and we're just off the heart. So it's freshly oxygenated blood. It's freshly ready to use. But we're detecting CO2 in those ranges, so we're predicting what's going to be occurring, essentially. So we are a prediction system. Hence, like anxiety, et cetera, is a thing for us because we're constantly in this predictive state of things going on, right?
So the chemoreceptors are actually predicting what they believe CO2 levels will be once it gets to the venous system. Is that how it works?
Yes, correct. Yeah, basically. Now, you also have a bunch of chemoreceptors up in the brain. So the brain is very carefully monitored, right? For a good reason. Because it needs oxygen on a constant, because it's on a glucose drip. That is basically a very necessary thing. That we do not want pH getting too acidic or getting too alkaline, right? So it'll do a number of things, namely, like when we become more sympathetic, it'll open doorways up for blood flow, et cetera, pretty quickly. However, if we're hyperventilating without the necessary metabolic components of that, where CO2 gets higher, right? And we need more oxygen, or when we're hyperventilating, we're offloading CO2. So the bloodstream becomes a bit more alkaline. And when that begins to happen, the sympathetic nervous system kicks on and the vasculature begins to constrict again. And that is where you'll get people who use hyperventilation techniques and breathing, who talk about getting euphoric or high or whatever. And that is simply the constriction of the blood vessels in your brain going into overdrive, the intelligence of what you are saying, no, I'm not going to allow you to do this thing that you're doing. I'll shut you down at the next stage and you'll pass out, and then you'll come online and normal breathing should ensue, right? At any rate.
Right.
So CO2 plays a very critical role in how all of this is occurring. Namely, also, the amygdala is a bit of a modulator of CO2. So it modulates how we're responding to CO2. So the nervous system is definitely tied into, if I'm in a heightened state, my adjustments are made for CO2 and my respiration rate picks up, right? It's not that my CO2 tolerance is necessarily diminished. It's the nervous system's responding in an adequate way in order to make the adjustments. So if I start doing push-ups or running, my respiration rate should pick up naturally, right?
Right. Yeah. So on the a couple things on that. So with the CO2 balance, I think you make a really important point, and I just want to kind of double click on it for a minute. Is that CO2 is our regulator of pH. It's one of our major regulators of pH. When our CO2 levels go up, so when we're hypoventilating, so we're not breathing as fast, for example, then that's going to have a buildup of CO2. You're going to get more acidotic. Okay, the body's going to get more acidotic. When you're hyperventilating, when you're breathing off a lot of CO2, you're going to have the opposite, where you're going to become more alkalonic. And this also has an effect on the oxygen dissociation curve as well, which is how much oxygen is being dumped into tissue depending on the status of your if you're more alkalotic, if you're more acidotic, right? So if you're more alkalotic, what is happening typically? You're getting more oxygen that's being dumped off, or is less being dumped off? It's the opposite,
less
right?
is being dumped.
Exactly.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
More alkaline, you do not get as much oxygen. More acidic, you're getting all that oxygen is dispersing off of the hemoglobin.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Right?
Most people don't realize that the hemoglobin carries four molecules of oxygen, but typically we have a lot of reserve there, right? So it's not like all four molecules are being dumped off into tissue at all times. It's usually that we actually have about 50% of those sites that stay bound with oxygen even after going through all of circulation. So then when you start doing more exercise, you're hyperventilating, but you're also creating more lactic acidosis. You're creating more of an acidotic type of system, and more of that oxygen is going to be dumped off into tissue. This is one of the things that I think is really important, because I have heard, and I'm sure you have heard this in the community, when it comes to hyperventilation, that this is always a good thing as far as breathing practices go.
Yeah.
But the problem, let's talk about that a little bit, is what happens. I mean, there's a lot of practices out there, and I know this is not something that you do specifically. I think you've had your experience with it in the past, but something like hyperventilatory types of breathing practices, like Wim Hof or others. Like, what are these doing to people, and what's like the benefit? What might be the danger of this as a result?
Well, a healthy individual can typically respond to something like the Wim Hof method pretty well. It's a high sympathetic response.
Right.
So you're becoming alkaline, so it's high sympathetic, into a dropout in parasympathetic response once the body's recovered or gone through the process, right?
Right.
However, there are a lot of caveats, and unfortunately, these things are not actually talked about due to the education of. I think when you create a method, there's a lot of issues that tend to follow with that. Meaning you're trying to sell the method, right? You don't want dangers around that. So that being said, anybody dealing with cardiovascular issues should probably stay away from these sorts of practices, anything hyperventilatory. It can cause an unneeded stress on the heart, especially the cells. So you're going in, you're disrupting the cells and you're agitating them, right? You're putting them into an excitatory state without the metabolic demand for that. Just a simple explanation of that. A healthy individual will recover from that as CO2 rises back up, oxygen disperses. So and people who deal with anxiety or have very dysregulated nervous systems should probably stay away from these practices as well, as you are going to disrupt the nervous system a lot.
Right, and it's not like most people are going and being parasympathetic the rest of the day. They're going back to their high-powered job, or they're going back to the gym and spending several hours there. They're going to the gym or whatever. They're on their phone 24/7 between sets at the gym, those kinds of things, right?
Correct.
So they're not like doing the sympathetic dump and then getting parasympathetic and then just staying there. So, and that's been one of my thoughts about the hyperventilatory. It's a hard word to say, hyperventilatory breathing.
Yeah.
But the other piece that they've added onto that is the exercise piece, which I wanted to ask you about, because I have a challenge with the way they describe how it increases the amount of oxygen in circulation when you do exercise while you are on a breath hold. After you've hyperventilated. What is, I mean, I'm not just trying to bag, Wim Hof here. This is just in general the idea of what is hyperventilatory breathing doing once you do that and then you start doing exercise with breath holds? Like, what is that? Is that really a benefit, or what is that benefit if there is one?
Well, it's not a real breath hold because you've blown off CO2, so you've retarded the curve of the oxygen dissociation curve, right? Which you were talking about, Bohr effect, whatever. So it's not a real breath hold, and in fact, you will never see anybody who does real, some people will hyperventilate pure oxygen because they've trained up and they'll hold their breath for 22 minutes because they, or 20 minutes or whatever, because
diving or something, right?
Right. Like they're doing something, they got people watching them, making sure they're okay, etc. However, this can cause what you're doing is you're shortening the curve to low oxygen. People don't understand that, right? So they think that if they could hold their breath for 3 or 4 minutes or 5 minutes in some cases, because they hyperventilate, they don't realize they've actually just shortened the oxygen dissociation curve. So meaning there's a time when there's oxygen gets so low in the body that you will pass out. The body it'll shut you down.
Right.
And on a normal breath hold, you have elongated that curve, except you are dealing with the burn and pain of what CO2, your chemoreceptors, and how either sensitive or unsensitive they are, right? So that allows you to hold your breath for a longer period of time. However, most people won't do that because they don't want to put in the work in order to build through that process and get really good and get the system healthy enough, namely the nervous system, in a healthy enough spot to remain calm in a very stressful situation, right? So it's a bit of a hack in breath holding, and you do not get more oxygen. What you do is you remove CO2, and you will see that oxygen saturation count go up to 100% when you hyperventilate. That's just bio unavailable oxygen.
Yes.
So this was where I was going to go with this in the beginning, where I was talking about with Campbell, where I was, it's actually, his name is Lewis Coleman, or it's Coleman. It's Lewis Coleman, MD, right? But he has made a very strong case, and I came to this conclusion myself after studying research, respiratory physiology, understanding Krebs cycle, getting into all of this stuff, is that oxygen is actually a useless molecule without CO2. There is you do not get anything out of oxygen, and actually oxygen is quite destructive.
It is.
In fact, it's killing or aging every one of us.
Yes. We pay Peter to pay Paul kind of thing, right? To use oxygen to make ATP, but there's a lot of issues with the amount of mitochondrial respiration that we're doing, and this is, mitochondrial aging is us aging, absolutely. And I love what you just said there about the oxygen not being available. And I think that's the part that I try to hammer in with people that are doing Wim Hof and other kinds of hyperventilatory, I can't say that word, hyperventilatory breathing.
Yeah.
It's there is a place for it. I absolutely think there
Mm-hmm.
is, but I think
Yes.
that what people think is that, and this is why I also wanted to talk about the oxygen dissociation curve, is that we think that because people don't realize when you're hyperventilating, you're getting less oxygen that's dumping off the red blood cells as opposed to more oxygen. And so there's going to be less that's going to be bioavailable, and that's why your oxygen sat is 100% when you're looking at it on a pulse ox or something like that. And then you're doing your exercise or whatever, you think and so it's really interesting to see that, that's obviously become very popular. And I think there's probably a place for some of this. But you were alluding to, earlier, the process of doing this slowly and having a buildup of tolerance over time. And I want to get there. But the first thing I want to talk about, this is related to the CO2 piece, is I heard you talk about this recently. I was hoping you could share some of the studies on people that don't have amygdalas and what happens with CO2. So I think that's super cool.
Yeah, this is fun. So this is Dr. Justin Feinstein's work. He's also the one with the amygdala and basically coming back. And he's a good friend of mine and a researcher who I've been working with for some time. He found that he did one of the papers on the amygdala being a modulator of CO2, and this is how he figured it out. Was he had some twins, a couple sets of twins who had calcified amygdalas. So these are people who are basically a detriment to themselves.
Fearless, yes.
Essentially fearless in a lot of states, in a lot of instances, meaning they just don't understand that putting their hand on a burner could, burn them, right? Or stepping off the curb into traffic, et cetera, et cetera. They brought them, he got a hold of them and got them in. They basically, what they found was, so he was running some tests on CO2 because he picked up on some work that he had been doing float tanks and CO2 and breathing, and he fell into this world, and he started administering bolus hits to anxious patients of CO2.
Okay.
And it was just a bolus hit. And anything that would make any of us have a little bit of a panicky feeling on one hit, but then everything subsequently after that is normal and you go back to normal. He was noticing that the patients who were on anxiety medications were actually responding better than they were from anxiety medications to panic and anxiety. Which is a duh for me, since the work I've done in and around this was like, the higher CO2 tolerance, the more regulated your nervous system is, the less anxious people are, right?
Right.
So he had found that when he gave these bolus hits, he decided to give these bolus hits of CO2 to the calcified amygdala group. And these folks panicked more. They had never experienced fear in their lives like this.
Wow.
And so this modulator obviously wasn't modulating anything. And so they got this hit, and it was like the world room closed. And I've felt this before where I've got an extreme dose of CO2, basically self-manufactured from intense exercise, and then gone on low oxygen.
Yes.
And quite literally the room goes like that big, and you are like just freaking out, need to get outside, need to find, it's intense, man. So at any rate, they basically figured out that this is the thing that's modulating things and undulating based on what we're seeing and experiencing and putting ourselves through.
I mean, I think what's really interesting about that are the implications, right? I mean, the sense that like we think of our amygdala as being this place where our fear centers are, where like if you don't have an amygdala, you don't think you'd ever have any fear, but you can induce it with a CO2 hit.
Turns
and
out.
And so that
nature
is a
don't
huge
care.
Nature, there's always a way. What they say in Jurassic Park, nature always finds a way, right?
Nature does find a way.
So the idea here is that, and you were describing this before, is that you said with people that have better CO2 tolerance, they have less anxiety, they have less stress. And so why is this? Why is that the case? And how can you help people create that so that they do have higher CO2 tolerance?
Well, I wouldn't know that they have less stress. I know that they can handle stress a lot differently.
Gotcha.
And So when you look at people, with the people I've been able to work with and see, I've seen some extreme ends of CO2 tolerance. I've seen them on both ends, right? And I've seen what happens even for myself and having, very, very, very high CO2 tolerance and then getting fairly low. Especially when I had a bit of that insomnia stuff going on, it really got, fairly low to where I was like, I was like, oh yeah. And it's interesting. So I'm going to need to commit to some things and slowing it down, getting my nervous system regulated and not doing too much on the other end of this, because that's what the world wants me to do. Right.
Don't get into hyperbaric chamber, go hypoxic training, and go swimming and go surfing
Right.
at the same
Yes.
day. Those kinds of things.
Don't
Gotcha.
do those things. We both know I like to play around in the extremes.
Yes. Yeah. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah. But no.
You find these ends of these things, but then you find when, especially on the lower end, like where people are hypersensitive to CO2, when you start to see them build a less hypersensitivity to it, things start to change radically. They're not as reactive anymore. And so you start to see their nervous system lets go a bit. And largely the CO2 tolerance thing becomes a big player within the nervous system. But you can build on this thing a lot more than what people really understand, and it helps develop a resilience. But the reason it's doing that is because CO2 is really the thing that's allowing for this other side of this capillary gate theory to open back up and allow for tissue gate theory, or the tissue to heal or open up or respond to become elastic again. Right? So when we slow our breathing down, let's just say a pranayama or a breath hold work session or something like that, you're feeling what it's like to have higher loads of CO2 in the system. And what happens is you'll notice that you start to heat up. So heat becomes a part of this process too. And that's another conversation. But mammals are terrible with heat. And that being a byproduct of the Krebs cycle as well, is a very interesting thing that plays a role because of what we see within Scandinavian countries and heat therapy, et cetera, and cardiovascular disease. So you're seeing rises in CO2 happen. So the vasculature's opening up.
Dilating, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So you're dilating. And so you're getting that other end of things to the sympathetic nervous system. So you can get very broad stroke parasympathetic responses to these practices if done correctly. Most people really in the breath space at this point are now simply looking for a place to find relief, right? So they're just getting protocols, which are great, because people are looking for relief because they're so burnt out or stressed out that they just want to calm down, right? But they're missing the other two sides of this. One being that resilience side I was just speaking about, but the more important side is the one of awareness. And that's where all the fruit is gathered. But you've got to be able to slow it down enough to be able to get in touch, to be able to be aware enough of what's going on around you to then go, oh, my breathing's a little different right now. Something's going on.
And yes, so dig into that awareness piece. So what are they becoming aware of? Is it their breathing? Is it how they feel? Is it all of the above?
All of the above. I begin it with getting people to just be aware of their breathing. I mean, that's usually what I'll start any session or talk with, is getting people into an awareness drill and then taking them through stress, then giving them some sort of breathing exercise that brings them down and in, and then administering the same sort of awareness drill. And I have not really had any negative feedback on that, where people are like, wow, like I was definitely more aware of my breathing without having to control it. Right. And it's not real easy to do, but that inevitably then comes into what I'm feeling. Like, why am I feeling frustrated right now since somebody just cut me off? Why am I taking this personal? Do they know who I am? Like, probably not.
Maybe they're on the way to the hospital, they're having a baby or something.
There could be 1,000 things. Or it could just be an asshole, and that asshole might have a gun in the car, and you know what? I'm good. Like,
you're good. You have firearms training, but no thanks, right?
Yeah,
no,
man. I mean, like, literally, I'll avoid any situation like that I know I need to, or I'd prefer to avoid those things.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. At any rate,
I mean, with the higher performance kinds of people that you're working with, like the athletes, the special forces guys, and that, I mean, even these, even in those guys that are really like on high performing in quotes, I mean, I'm sure you've seen dramatic shifts in how they respond to stress, and how have they started doing any of these things more, I guess, more as like as bigger groups, or are you just kind of working with individuals with their particular issues and things?
I typically now work with individuals. I've long kind of been an individual person. However, I have gone in to do some group stuff. I you know, with a lot of like within inside the prison system, it's definitely had, from a group context, it's definitely had an impact from what I've been able to see. You look at individual athletes, it usually has a very potent response with the individual who goes through it, if they're willing to go through it.
Right.
Unfortunately, within inside the military, so much of it is so
Political?
driven. Well, yeah, but I mean, it's unfortunately the military is not really set up real well for the how should I say? And I don't want to like just toss the word trauma around, but it is fairly
Right.
systemic, and it's
Sure.
really because most people aren't, most guys and gals for that matter that get involved in the military aren't doing the foundational work to
Right.
understand why they're making the decisions they're making and putting themselves into the scenarios that they're putting, and so they end up compartmentalizing this stuff so in such a way to where it's like it becomes a real issue down the road,
Right.
because
Right.
they're either protecting themselves from feeling this pain or avoiding the pain, right?
Right. Sure.
Um, like the whole the concept of discipline is a failed concept. It's the exact opposite of what freedom actually is. It's a control thing, versus freedom being outcome independent of things. So I'm able to navigate whatever the outcome is, even though I might be driven to accomplish something or do something. How I respond to that and make wine out of water is up to me, right? And I think we get confused with the whole discipline thing because everything's difficult when we first do it.
Of course. Yeah.
Right.
Of course.
And so
Yes.
we're like, oh, we've got to be disciplined to do this because it's difficult. And it's like, no, if you actually find that you care about this and want to learn enough about this, you will actually go back and you'll start to see your progress with it, and you'll be inspired through that process. At any rate, that's where it gets pretty difficult with inside team dynamics.
Sure.
Like that.
Yeah. So individuals is the easiest
There's
way
a
to see
lot of
them.
egos, right? And
Oh, yeah,
people
totally.
are compartmentalizing things in a lot of different ways. And sports are basically the same thing as like the military, because you've got a lot of people who are trying to compete to be at the top level. And it's not that winning is everything. It's just that losing, they don't like real well.
Yeah, sure. And there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen too, right? You have all the trainers and all the people that have been on these teams and have a lot of, they have a lot riding on those kinds of positions, and other people coming in. And then Brian comes in.
You've got a contract for millions of dollars and you're expected to do something. I can see how it's difficult. However, there is another way. And
Indeed.
we just don't understand that other way, and where I'm alluding to, oh, but there isn't anybody really doing that. Well, no, there are some people doing that. You're just not wanting to see that.
Right. Yeah, blindsided or tunnel vision.
Yeah.
So a couple of things I was thinking about. So one would be like a cool example, if you have one, of what somebody like a fighter. I think you've had a couple of fighter examples, and others, people that you've worked on CO2 tolerance with, and what that's been able to do for them, and what that results on some of their competitions or some of their games and things like that. Do you have any stories you can share, or any, even if it's not names of people?
Yeah, I mean, I actually put something up on my Instagram account with a CrossFit athlete who he's a fairly well-known kid from Australia, and he went through a full dose of what it is I do, and he made some very considerable changes. I posted those changes, especially to aerobic threshold, anaerobic threshold, and VO2 max. And I lined out some of his training. It's a few posts back, but
Nice. Okay.
It's pretty detailed in there. I've had fighters who make pretty large changes. Granted, we're going from post-fight, where they have a downside, and so we go into a build phase, right, where they're building a big a much bigger engine. So I'm forcing breath control in a manner where we're getting diaphragm and intercostal engagement on everything we're doing. And
wow.
although
Okay.
that's happening to everybody in some cases, what I've been able to see with the little side of research we've been able to implement on this, especially at the UFCPI, is that when people are allowed to breathe the way they want to breathe, when they will divert to mouth breathing fairly soon. And this is where myself and some respiratory physiologists have big problems. Many think that you should just allow people to breathe the way they want, the way they fall into breathing. While I don't totally disagree with that, I do disagree with that. In that, if we are training for something, what I have seen is that we have primary respiratory muscle engagement into very high levels of physical stress. And when we don't do that, we are seeing compensatory respiratory muscle engagement, which is limiting and very anaerobic in nature because they're smaller muscle groups. They're attached to the neck and to the arms, and they're pulling on things and putting us into positions that become very sympathetic dominant.
Yeah, accessory muscles. Yeah, these are the accessory muscles in breathing.
So they're either known as secondary, accessory, or compensatory. So I will say compensatory in that when I can get an athlete to do the exact same work but use primary respiratory breathing muscles, that was compensatory. And so we can redesign out how this athlete is actually functioning on a day-to-day basis with their unconscious breathing patterns.
So is the idea with CO2 tolerance that you're shifting your anaerobic and aerobic capacity, right?
In essence, yeah, you can see pretty. So this is the other thing where I start to where I'm in uncharted territory.
Fun.
Well, yeah, you know, it's funny because like I'm just shocked that none of these questions were ever asked in exercise physiology.
Yeah.
What happens if we control somebody's breathing or switch them from nasal to mouth? And what's the difference between nose and mouth breathing if somebody's just walking per se? And we started doing that stuff with metabolic carts, and it was pretty interesting what we were seeing. And it was definitely a difference in how we're using energy. So when beta oxidation is no longer beta oxidation.
Let's dig into that, because I think that's really where I wanted to go next is let's talk about some of those studies that you were doing and what you noticed and the differences between nasal breathing and mouth breathing.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it just started off as a question. Well, I wonder what would happen, what we would see, like from a gas exchange perspective.
Yeah.
And so we started doing that. And so I had several metabolic carts at that time. I've also gone up to Dr. Jimmy Bagley's lab up at San Francisco State University to test some of this stuff in a light format. But most of the stuff was done with myself and individuals I was working with, where we were using metabolic carts and just wanted to see what we were seeing and seeing if it was universal, what we were saying. And it just so happened to be quite universal. I think the most telling thing would be from an aerobic base perspective. If your mouth is open, you are spending money with your savings account that you don't need to be spending. And that was very telling with a lot of elite level athletes.
So you're depleting your aerobic capacity much faster.
Correct.
If you're mouth breathing.
Yeah. Yep.
And the question is why? Why is that the case? Do we know?
You're over breathing at any stage is over breathing.
Gotcha.
Right? And so if I'm a little CO2 hypersensitive, which, you know, athletes tend to be a little neurotic, so they might sit in that, you know.
So like a mild hyperventilatory state.
A little, hey, this just or even if they don't, like, oh, this is just easy. I mean, there's not a day that does not go by where I won't see somebody walking or on their bike, barely working, and their jaw is just wide open. And it's like, is it necessary? And they don't even know, right? But then on the other side of this is people who haven't even looked at this, who are just be like, that doesn't matter. And and it's like, have you done the work? And I I looked at this, and that's why I'm talking about it. Is
Right.
oh yeah, it does matter, and we were seeing very different levels of aerobic function happening if I had my mouth open versus closed, and was it necessary? And wasn't. If it wasn't necessary, my mouth didn't need to open. I was getting a very different response.
So your aerobic capacity was going up dramatically
Yeah.
or significantly
Yeah,
if you
well, we were
kept your
actually
mouth.
training it in a very different way, not only
Right.
from a ventilatory standpoint, so from a
Inspiratory perspective.
inspiratory perspective, like
Yeah.
our musculature, right? We were training those muscles, which I'll just divert back to what the research says on that, in that blood stealing is a real thing, which is also known as the metaboriflex. And it doesn't matter if you're paying attention to your breathing or not. Don't worry, your body is going to prioritize your breathing muscles over everything else, meaning your locomotor muscles. So if you're not prioritizing your breathing muscles, guess what? They're going to start sucking blood from the locomotor sooner.
Right. That's why you just fall down, kind of.
Correct. And you're burning through unnecessary sugar, right?
Right.
So you're just spending currency you don't need to. And that doesn't mean that you're going anaerobic if your mouth's open, but you're definitely into more anaerobic territory than necessary.
Gotcha. And so is it a couple of things? So you said blood stealing, which is one of my favorite terms as well. This is back to the capillary action before that we were talking about too, where the body is like a highway system that always has these sphincter systems, or these areas where you're stopping blood flow. And then it opens when it needs it. So like, for example, you don't have a lot going to your muscles, you and I right now, because we're just hanging out talking. But if we were running, then the capillary beds in those areas would open up. And then as a result, you'd start getting more blood flow that way. So we talk about using pressure, for example, in a hyperbaric chamber. This is another way you can sort of open up some of those valves and some of those sphincters so you get more blood flow to those areas. But it's really interesting, and I think people forget this. I forgot this until you said this to me a little while ago, is that like we basically prioritize all of our muscles. The respiratory muscles are prioritized before almost any other muscle group, or they are the ones that are prioritized over any other muscle. Yeah.
Well, they are, because they're always on.
They have to be.
They have to be.
Yeah,
for energy's sake, right?
Yeah, and I always think about the brain in this case, and that the brain is getting 20% of our oxygen at all times, and so that's why when, for example, like if your blood pressure goes down or something, like you pass out, like the brain is going to try to protect itself at all times too, and the lungs and the muscles, the primary and the accessory muscles, or the compensatory muscles. I like that better as a compensatory idea. I didn't realize that all those three things were the same.
Well, it is secondary if that be the case, right, for you. And then, but is it really necessary? And if it ain't necessary, guess what?
Right. Then you're going to improve your aerobic capacity, is what it comes down to. If you don't have to recruit those muscles as you're going. One question I had with the nasal breathing is that there's the nasal inspiration, and then there's the expiration. So did it matter if you had a expiration through your mouth or through your nose, and what did that change or shift?
Yes. That's actually the more important process.
Oh, okay.
I mean, tell me. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's just as important.
Just as important.
You're limiting how much air can come out. So I can, right? Or double, if not triple the length. I've got to take to get the air out, right?
To get the air out, sure.
So what I'm doing is I'm retarding CO2's offload a bit, right?
Decreasing the amount you can blow off at any one time.
Yeah.
So what is that? So what happens as a result of that?
So now we're talking about the Bohr effect a little bit more.
Right.
Like, oh, how much oxygen am I actually offloading as I go here, right? And so I'm actually using up more of the oxygen as necessary, right?
Yes, exactly.
So I'm actually remaining in more beta oxidative states, which for the layman is fat burning, right? And that is the creme de la creme for health, because that is what the mitochondria love.
They want to stay aerobic, man, and then you're dumping more oxygen in tissue because you are preventing the CO2 blow off, which is, I think there's like huge affinity for me, or epiphany, when I heard this first. I was like, this is exactly why Brian's work is so important for what I'm doing, at least I was being very selfish on the hyperbaric side. I'm like, this makes so much sense, because all of us, like you said, we have these natural ways of breathing, but it doesn't mean that naturally is the way. There's natural ways of breathing now, right? As opposed to what our ancestors, when they were hunter gatherers, how they would have been breathing. This is more like the animals that we were talking about before. And when they were running, they probably were panting at times too. But and I'm guessing, and I don't know if you have any evidence, and very evidence of this. Is there evidence of like ancient cultures and how they were breathing, and is there anything that we know about that? I just out of interest.
A guy by the name of George Catlin wrote a book. He's a historian. He was documenting the transition of civilized and indigenous culture in North and South America. Saw over 1 million indigenous people, and the takeaway that he got through his history was that he wrote a book called "Shut Your Mouth and Save Your Life."
Beautiful.
The difference was these people were hunting, gathering, sleeping with their mouths shut.
Wow.
Almost all of the time. Their kids specifically, babies specifically, coming off of the nipple, mothers would make sure they closed their mouth because they were in fear of what was called the black mouth.
The black mouth. This is
that was what white man had, was this dirty black mouth with rotting teeth from sugar and booze and all of the stuff, and being as stressed as we were,
right, sure.
So, and it's really simple to kind of think about, because if you just go look at wild animal, you just look at wild mammalian culture. Well, how do their nervous systems function? We started basically there. It was like, they're like, boom, they respond right back to parasympathetic activity very quickly. So does their blood gas. Their blood gas changes can go exceptionally high and drop back out, right? Where ours are at like this moderate state and take a while because we're just so stressed. And it's very interesting.
Yeah, they can get their lactates up super high. Some animals, I'm sure you know this more than me.
Yeah.
What are the highest animals? Like some of the animals, do you know that can get their lactates up the highest?
I don't know, but I do know that there's a few human beings, like professional athlete wise, rowers in particular, they've sat up around 20 plus millimoles at the end of a 16-minute effort, right?
Wow. Just to give somebody the normal is less than 2.
Correct.
As far as if you're looking at a laboratory analysis, and they're getting to 20.
Lactate threshold being around 4.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Okay. So one thing we're talking, I'm super interested in the history of the side of this just for a minute, is that one thing we also know is that when you're mouth breathing, it also changes the dynamics or the facial structure of people that are mostly mouth breathing as well. And this gives you a higher risk of having things like sleep apnea, your tonsils, because the other issue with breathing through your mouth is that you don't have the filter that goes through your nose, right? And so as a result of that, you're getting more, your tonsils get larger, your adenoids get larger, and then you have sleep apnea and everything else that goes along with that. So with mouth breathing, I mean, obviously, I love that book. I have to go read it now, and learning more about the indigenous culture. Did he talk about like the athletes, and as they were, or not the athletes, like the hunters, as they were running through and for wild game and things like that, they always had their mouth shut, always breathing through their nose. Yeah.
And it would make sense too. The more you start to like read into this, look into this. I mean, I went in, I wasn't trying to prove any of this. It was just rabbit hole after rabbit hole. The food we eat, it's gotten softer and softer and softer year after year after year after year, right?
Right.
It's like you chew something that's hard to chew from being a child, a baby who just got teeth. Like that's what was happening.
Sure.
The jaw is much more malleable than it is now, even though it still is like we're plastic till the day we die. It expands, right? So the jaw expands, it widens, the palate widens. When that widens, the maxilla widens. The sinuses now have deep cavities in them, and it's easier to breathe versus how it is now.
I didn't realize that was a connection there.
Breastfeeding has a very, very critical role in how your breathing will be when you are older. We no longer are breastfeeding very long. That is wreaking havoc on how the palate works. And this is all the manifestation of civilization, of comfort and convenience. And it's been a problem. And then having people at the forefront kind of like not paying attention to any of this and ignoring kind of this, or picking how to use science to prove what they're doing or show that we could
cherry
do
picking.
something. Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. I don't think I've made the direct connection as much as you just kind of laid it out there with the ideas of especially chewing and how this has changed so much over the last many decades. I mean, all of our food, even like wheat and other kinds of things that we used to have to actually have like a ton of fiber. It used to be hard, like your German breads of like the old school, right? Like the pumpernickels and like the ones that were like hard and things like you had to, really chew. And even before this, like when we were hunter gatherers and eating tubers and eating berries and all those kinds of things. I mean, the banana that we see now, right, is nothing like the banana that was back 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. It was much more fibrous. It was much harder. It was less sugary and all these things. And I'm just kind of floored by the idea that had such a significant impact on our jaw and our palate itself. I've known about breastfeeding. Yeah.
You can see it. Why do these guys have perfect jaws? Well, I wonder how they were breathing. And then when we go back and start to look at, look, this is what's been documented about breathing on indigenous cultures. They were nasal breathing. Like it's not somebody was like, oh, they're mouth breathers. No.
Yeah. So how do you, so like for the rubber hits the road kind of thing, how do you actually increase somebody's CO2 tolerance? I mean, I know you have a couple of ways that you're doing this with you in your community. I mean, are there simple things that people can do or?
I mean, we've got the easy way without doing any other work is, they can go to shiftadapt.com/breathwork and they can go and take the exhale test that we have. And then they can match that up with a breathing rhythm and follow that for 5 to 10 minutes twice a day, and they'll get.
It's not a competition, ladies and gentlemen. That's what that's the thing that I think it's important when you guys are looking at this kind of testing. And Brian, I'm sure you can talk about this more. But the problem with most people, myself included, is like, I want to hold my breath for as long as I can. It's not, but it's not that, right? It's a little bit different.
No, I mean, the exhale test is definitely an objective test. It's a start point from a full inhale to a full exhale as slow as you possibly can. You're going to respond to the CO2. You're going to dump air, or you're going to panic, or you're going to run out of air. So if one of those things happens, we have a result of that, and then we have a breathing rhythm that you can input your number that matches that you can play with. There's also breath hold work, which is cool. But that is, to your point, most people who do breath hold work aren't really engaging correctly. What they're doing is they're actually trying to hold their breath as long as they can. Yes. You don't actually need to do that to get big results, because this is really CO2 tolerance is futile if my nervous system is hot, right?
Yes.
So it's really taking the time to slow it down and calm it down, and then be able to play inside of that with it. That's where my work really comes in, is I will develop breathing practices for people and physical, like training practices for people so that they can implement this stuff with breath control in an appropriate way. But it really is about how you manage stress in your day to day.
So before you start getting involved in like crazy breath hold practices, the first steps are to really start being able to manage your nervous system, your parasympathetic and sympathetic balance with basic breath control and slow buildup of CO2 tolerance before you start going crazy with, not even crazy, but even start getting really in depth into the breath holds. Would that be the right statement to make? Or?
Correct.
Gotcha. Yeah. Because, breath holding is super interesting to me, and not so much from the how long you can hold your breath, because like that's the cool thing to do after blowing off all your CO2. But one thing you and I talked about a little bit earlier, one of our first conversations back a little while ago, was related to oxygen carrying capacity and how breath holds are interrelated with this. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Rarely will an individual dip into...
I'm rare. What can I tell you?
Rarely do people actually dump into places where they dip into their oxygen reserves or make it so that their actual respiratory system is going to engage due to lack of oxygen in it, right?
Right.
It's roughly, so it's like 40, I think it's 40 milligrams or something, or 70% roughly. It's 70% SpO2.
Yes.
or less. You have detective systems that are basically sending off bell alarms, right? Mm. If you do the Wim Hof method or hyperventilate and hold your breath, you will reach that very easily. If you just hold your breath without hyperventilating, you probably will not see your SpO2 level drop below 90%. Mm. In most cases with most people. The more trained you get at this stuff, yes, you start to see your ability to drop that down. So the more consecutive you, or I should say, the more the more consistent you are with this type of work, the longer you can actually hold to actually use up the oxygen in the system to where it becomes a real factor, which in essence, I feel is like kind of, this is where maybe the fountain of youth exists. Because it's the response off of that that's actually creating, that's getting a lot of these genes to switches to happen with this like HIF1A, et cetera. Now, granted, you're going to have to do a lot of work to get there, or you can do altitude type training stuff. But I do believe that look, what I do and my clients do is a combination of the work that you do and what I do. And it's like this breath. There's breath control. Obviously, we've connected through the breath control with inside the hyperbarics, but also with the hypoxia work. I have many of my clients doing low oxygen training because of the results that come with that stuff.
That's where I was going with all this, is the idea of, as like, so to get sort of like in the fun aspects for you and I is like, so how are you developing hypoxic training programs in the setting of understanding CO2, understanding aerobic, anaerobic balance? Like, what are some basic frameworks that people can think about without, getting crazy? And of course, none of this is direct medical advice, ladies and gentlemen. So please, do it with a trainer or somebody that, you know very well before you start.
Yeah, if you can get your CO2 tolerance above 60 seconds, if you can get your breath hold time, inhale breath hold time, upwards of 3 minutes, I start to move people into a lot of these places where they get where we get into the advanced fun shit. And unfortunately, the world wants to always be playing in that advanced fun stuff. And what I've experienced is that is a very bad idea.
Yes.
It goes south pretty quickly with people. Yes. So meaning I just do not engage a client into hypoxic training, or I don't introduce them to you in hyperbaric chambers until they've actually done the foundational work. And then once that's in place, then these things start to, we get to implement protocol around that stuff, and it gets real fun. So yeah, of one client in particular of mine who will remain nameless, but he is, every other day it's hypoxic work, whether it's static or on a bike or in long period time. And then on the other days, he's in the hyperbaric chamber, and he's got breath control stuff where he's going up and down as well. So that we're adding in the CO2 component, so that as we've brought in a lot of oxygen on board, we're actually going to use that oxygen. It's not just going to be and this is where a lot of people, and I also do work around hyperoxygen stuff outside of the hyperbaric chamber. But you have to have high levels of CO2 in order for this to work. If you do not, that is where oxygen becomes a very big problem.
And what's the problem? What's the problem if you're not careful?
You could have some very detrimental problems with oxygen if there's not adequate amounts of CO2. There's very big health risks that can happen.
Right. Because, your body is not going to be able to compensate. Right. And then if you're going to be low oxygen, but you don't realize it, because we talked about this and we alluded to it earlier, but your main impetus to breathe is not oxygen, right? It's CO2. And if you're playing with CO2, but your oxygen levels are low, and it can certainly mess things up if you haven't done the basic work and put a lot of stress on the system, for sure. So I wanted to give a little bit of a tease of all that for everybody, because I think most of us, and myself included, would be in that initial stage where we're still looking at CO2 tolerance, and we're looking at, breath holds, and that piece as being like the foundation. And then on top of that foundation, that's where you can get really interesting. I mean, of course, I use a hyperbaric chamber without people that have done your work for various types of healing and optimization and energy production.
Yeah, as will I.
Of course, yeah. But I mean, but in essence, like if you're going to start playing around with a lot of hyperoxic and hypoxic training, and especially if you're going to be combining these things together, you're going to be shifting your oxygen dissociation curve all over the place. You're going to have to make sure that your breathing's under control. It's because otherwise you're going to put a lot of sympathetic stress on the system, and that can cause issues, as you and I both know.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, think about it from the perspective of what we've discussed so far, and that if I've got a lot of oxygen on board, I become more alkaline. I constrict the vasculature, right? Like it's the brain. The intelligence of you is far more more intelligent than your thinker.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. We forget that they're like the sort of the macroscopic ideas of like what's happening right now. You and I are speaking. Things are happening at like trillions of times a second,
right?
To give us energy, to let us do everything that we're doing, and even our response to this conversation is delayed. Like the input that you're giving from your conversation to my nervous system is delayed, and because we have to process all that, but we don't notice it because it's happening so goddamn fast somehow, right? And so. It's just amazing, I think, for people's perspective here. Like I always say, there's 1 billion oxygen molecules per red blood cell, 1 billion, right? And the amount of CO2 is comparable, right? Because you're always trying to balance these, as we've talked about. So just what's happening is it's always important to not only think about how you feel, but actually start measuring in various ways to really know that like what we're doing now is just a lot of it is compensatory for living shitty lives of stress and lack of sleep and poor sunlight and all those kinds of things. So
yeah, well, I mean, look, the average male carries 120 something liters of carbon dioxide in the system, most of it made up of bone, but
okay.
The oxygen,
that's a higher number than I would have thought.
Yeah. 20 liters of that exists as free gas, right? So lungs, etc. Whereas when you look at something like oxygen, it's like 1.8, or it's tiny.
Yeah. Wow.
Of what that's going on. And so this is where the whole idea of like, or not idea, but like the statement of oxygen is useless without CO2. It's like, look, man, there's a whole lot more CO2 in you than you realize, that is making things work in much more profound ways than what oxygen is. It's just we're so focused on what oxygen's doing, and it's got such a niche place in energy and where we've identified thus far what is health in terms of the cell, like the mitochondria, right? And that being so important, and oxygen being used as a catalyst in an enzymatic process to run this most efficient process of energy transfer that we understand. That is so complex, we don't totally understand it.
Yeah.
Nor can we replicate it.
Yeah. So can you repeat those numbers one more time? As I think I cut you off by accident when you were saying how much CO2 is actually in the body compared to oxygen.
Yeah, it's roughly like 120 liters, I believe, and 20 of that is gas. So the bone, et cetera, has carbon dioxide, right? Like,
Yeah.
Then when you look at oxygen, you have like a liter of oxygen and a liter of like nitrogen in you.
Yeah. So comparatively speaking, these are new numbers for me even to think about. I mean, the amount of CO2 in there, in the body is in there for a reason, right? It's not just because it's the waste product of energy metabolism, that's for sure. So
yeah, which has been my hang up. It's like, wow, the medical world really, they come up with some choice things.
Even respiratory physiologists, right? I mean,
I've worked education.
I work in critical care situations. I mean, I do a lot of that work in the hospital still too. And that's all we think about CO2 as. Like, it's not thought about as having this sort of intricate balancing nature and all these sort of many facets of our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And I think the key really is kind of coming back to the beginning of this whole conversation is like, well, how do you work with people, right? What are we really trying to accomplish here? And this is all related to your relationship with yourself and how stress is, and how you're stressing the body, and how that is and how you're using that information to change their physiology.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've spent, I don't know, close to 25 years at this kind of like game where it was like playing all the extra or the external game of things to where it was like I was really working to figure out what we were really doing. And I think I'm finally at that place where it's like in the last 5-10 years, it's like I really got into, I'm not like that. The points, the lift, the heavier weights, the faster times are great, but I have no real interest in that. I'm more interested in you wanting to do some introspective work that really revolves around that has outcomes that change all of these things. However, those aren't the goals. That's a futile, as Bruce Lee states, all goals apart from the means are I think what is it? All goals apart from the means are an illusion. Becoming is a denial of being.
That's beautiful. And actually, that leads to my last question for you, which we've kind of alluded to a lot of these kinds of things. And then I want to know, I'll make sure everybody knows where to find you and some of the work that you're doing. Is the podcast question that we ask everybody is, what are the 3 things anybody can do to live smarter, not harder, in your opinion? We've talked about, I'm sure, many of those already, but if you could think of 3 that you can kind of for takeaways for people when they're thinking about, what they can do after listening to this podcast.
Yeah. I think first is identify 1 or 2 things. It usually starts with 1 that is not an easy stressor, but it's not like a heavy duty emotional stressor. Something that you think you could learn from or manage in some capacity and go at that as if your life depended upon it to learn.
Okay.
And go into that. And so, there's part 1. Part 2 is don't react to it.
Okay.
Right? What I mean by that is be able to make a different decision or choice about that, even though it's creating a feeling that makes you want to respond, right? Or want to react. And the third part of that is just allow that to guide you into being aware of other stressors in your life that you could then start to make changes to. The downstream effect of that is, in my experience, is unimaginable to the fruit or the freedom that you'll experience. And I think that's really where the heart of all work and what we're all striving to get to understand. And we, I talked about driving, and that was one of those things where I challenged myself to drive the speed limit for like a week, and I couldn't do it the first time I tried it. And I quit because I was just so reactive, and I was like, wanting to drive faster. And then I did it. And I came back to it and I did it. And in 2 days of this process, I understood that was the way I was going to be driving the rest of my life.
Wow. Okay.
And it still takes work to remain there, but I'm the guy that drives in cruise control, and I get in the slower lane.
Of all places.
LA.
Yeah.
I get in the slow lane. If somebody's speeding or on my ass, I have no problem getting over, and I don't take it personally. I used to take it personal. I got upset. I was constantly, what I saw was somebody who was trying to be somewhere he was not and couldn't enjoy that process. And, I am since a very different human being as a result of that. It's not, that's not the only work. There's a lot of stuff, but like when I'm in the gym training, I am off of my phone and I am paying attention to everything I'm doing with very, very strict intention to learn how I'm responding to stress, the physical stress of training, so that I can learn what I can do differently or grow from, right? And that's very different from what it was 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's a huge evolution, man. And this is the evolution for the work that you're doing for people to be able to access too. So talk to me a little about, and talk to everybody about like your company Shift Adapt and the evolution of what you guys are doing there, just to finish up, so that, because there's a lot of resources you guys provide for free, which is amazing. And there's a lot of other workshops and things that you guys are doing, but it's not just about breathing anymore either, for sure. No. There's a lot more you guys are up to. Obviously, you're a relationship guy. So talk a little bit about that as I don't want to take too much of your time.
So I think the crux, the big picture of what we do now is basically what's called Shift Health, which is the business of Shift is a membership site, but it also offers programs, right? Or a program. People could also hire me for consultation. However, that is very limited and also an expensive thing, because of just limited availability. We're trying to make this more accessible to people in a large format, which is what Shift Health is. It's basically taking everything we've somewhat discussed today and boxing it up in a process of understanding what the things I value, where my attention is, where my deep work is, and how my relationships are. And that encompasses how to train, how we look at breath control, the physiology of stuff, all of it. And it's a 2.5 month process. That starts mid-February, the first one. But then we also have a membership site where we actually offer training and where we have breathe and move stuff. Emily runs a lot of that stuff. Breathwork stuff, training that I program, where we have breathing gears, which is what we've talked about around the training. It's implemented into the actual training of stuff. That's like, so this stuff's $30 a month. And there's a lot of information that comes in and is offered behind the membership portal with that. And then there's the free stuff, which is, we put out a great deal of information that's free and allow people to start themselves and figure it out on their own, if they should choose,
And then I think also just to mention your app, right? The one that's coming out.
Yeah, Numa. We're working to get that out. We're still in beta and getting a lot of feedback. And we're running some data on things and seeing what's happening with people. So we're actually doing a little more due diligence, and I'm very glad we are, on what's happening with people. Like, we're collecting the information to see how they're improving, like what they're doing with this whole stress resilience idea around breathing.
Right. So the idea with the app is to try to take people on a journey, similar to what you were doing on the websites and some through the courses, but doing this more individually and trying to get that individualized feedback.
Correct. Right? Numa, and that is PNEUMA, Numa.plus, and that's where they can find that at.
Yeah. Well, Brian, this has been awesome. I think I have like at least 20 more questions for you, but we'll have to talk about them next time I see you in LA, or maybe another podcast at some point.
Absolutely. Not a problem. Well, I appreciate you having me on. I know we obviously get along real well. I also wanted to mention HHPF, which is the HHP-foundation.org, which is where we have a lot of research that we're just pumping out. We're not only doing, but we're actually gathering whatever's going on around the non-pharmacological uses of understanding stress.
And this is a nonprofit organization too, right?
Nonprofit.
It's awesome. I meant to mention that. So thanks so much for. Please, guys, check that out. Check out all of Brian's places if you want to work with him. He's in LA, and you can't find him very easily. He's busy. So thanks so much for spending the time with us, Brian, and educating. I hope this was helpful for everybody. And do you have any personal websites or anything else you want to send them to? Or
no, that's it. Good? Shiftadapt.com you'll find everything there.
Yeah, and you can find Brian on Instagram too at his name too. You guys are looking for stuff. So anyway, have a great rest of your day, dude, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, man.